And Beamer here, day 10 of 11 Days of Remembrance. Resistance and collaboration, partisans and puppet regimes, and occupied Europe. By the end of 1941, the whole of Europe, from the outskirts of Moscow to the Pyrenees and from Crete to the Arctic Circle, was, with the exception of neutral Sweden and Switzerland, in Nazi hands. The treatment of conquered peoples was always cruel, but just how cruel the Nazis regarded all ethnic and ethnic origins. The Nazis regarded all slaves as subhuman. For example, in spite of propaganda talk of liberating the Russians from communism, the Nazis were only indicated in exploring Slavic people. Will the thrive or starve to death concerns me only from the point of view of our need for them as slave labor for our own civilization, said SS Chief Henchman Hilmer. In all other respects, I am totally different. The Danes, Norwegian, and Dutch, on the other hand, were considered to be Germanic. Norway and Holland were put under the control of civilian commissioners, while in Denmark Hitler only demanded his own nominee as prime minister after the Danish king had failed to reply congratulations on his 72nd birthday. In most occupied countries, there was little local support for the Nazis. Norwegian and Dutch fascists like Quisling and Alton Mazurt were given power, but they were deeply unpopular. Even Hitler regarded them with contempt. He described Quisling as a blown-up robber pig with emits a loud squeaker noise and the collapse. Some local fascists were also prepared to break back the Gestapo or join the SS, but these were generally few and far between. At the end of the war, fascist leader Merkel dissent. These men were either captured or put on trial, or like the French fascist leader Merkel dissent, they simply disappeared. But the Germans needed collaborators to make the occupation work, and where normal life ended and collaboration began, joining the notorious militia in France was clearly collaboration, having day-to-day vesting more the local women who considered the German soldiers. It was a time of most darkness, in which individuals had to group their way forward as best they could. Nonetheless, as it became clear that the Germans might not win the war after all, occupied people turned ingeniously to different forms of resistance. To start with, resistance took the form of symbolic gestures or civilian disobedience. Slogans were dubbed on walls, which the vast majority of Norwegians refused to play sports because they did not want to be associated with the Nazi sports administration. The churches were often in the forefront of non-violent protests. All stopped crowds listening to an anti-Quisling sermon at Tutland Cathedral, and the Belgian Prime Minister von Reulle judged that it was wrong for Catholics to collaborate in the establishment of a tyrannical regime. Indeed, they are under an obligation to work with those who resist such as regime. Later in the war, the sacrament was denied members of the Nazi police in Belgium. The Belgian fascist leader Leon Diderot was even excommunicated in 1943 following a punch-up with his local den. The Jews have got to be got out of Europe, if necessary, by applying the most brutal method. Goodrow told in his diary in March 1942, no other government and no other regime would have the strength for such a global solution as this. Sometimes non-cooperation took place because of the Nazis' final solution. In February 1941, there was a mass strike in Holland following the arrest of Jews while the Danish king threatened to equivalent if anti-Semitic legislation was introduced in his country. In Croatia, the Archbishop of Zagreb demanded the local liberation government confirm the rumors of deportation, and after the BBC revealed the fate of 700,000 Polish Jews in a broadcast in June 1942, there was resistance even in Germany. The churchmen Karl Friedrich Chudwick and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were arrested and later exterminated for outspoken condemnation of the regime. Then there was the underground news, good from the BBC European service, and from Swiss radio. Up to 12,000 Belgians were involved in producing 300 underground newspapers. The first one being published the day after Belgian forces surrendered. In France, at least 1,000 underground papers and printers were distributed during the occupation, while the Danish underground newspapers had a circulation of 10 million. Even in Germany, an estimate of 10 million people listened to the BBC towards the end of the war. Throughout, the punishment for doing so was death. If there was a single Nazi policy that encouraged resistance, however, it was the provision of workers while they learned to make expenses from stolen chemicals or equipment airdropped by the British and Americans. In Britain itself, resistance agents were trained in special schools and routine in out of Europe were developed for resistance leaders or escaped Allied airmen. Most risked to help with the acts of subversion. Outright resistance or sabotage needed great courage. Anyone caught faced certain death, and brutal examples were made of the incident. Such resistance became into savage as the war went on. In France, generally, Willem Cotterell, later hanged as a war criminal, used his infamous night in fog order to set out a respectable rate of 100 civilian deaths for every German killed and 50 for every German wounded. By the end of the war, at least 30,000 French hostages had been shot. In May 1942, following the assassination of brutal Nazi ruler of German-occupied Czechoslovakia, Ronald Reagan, the village of Lish was demanded and everyone in it murdered or deported as a lesson. Other victims included 622 inhabitants of the French village of Onche-Guin massacred by an SS. Following the Normandy landings in 1942, by early 1944, Some resistance groups were tempted into outraged battles with the Germans. Over 4,000 men of the French forces de their FFI, for example, fought for a week at Montmut before being overwhelmed. Another section rose up at Versailles and Verdun. Tragedy mistaken belief that an Allied air landing was imminent. Despite such disasters, by June that year, the French resistance could probably provide the Allies with the equivalent of almost 15 divisions behind enemy lines. In the months that followed, they would hunt down the last remnants of the Nazi regime and take some revenge on many of those who had covenanted with it. Alright, let's go to the next chapter, shall we? Liberation. The Allies advanced on all fronts. D-Day. The Normandy landings. In November 1943, Stalin finally agreed to meet Roosevelt and Churchill at the Roosevelt was determined to reach agreement with the Russians, even if it meant allying with his old friend Churchill. The conference began. Usually Churchill had completely lost his voice and was forced to listen, with Stalin ruthlessly criticizing Chiang Kai-shek and Roosevelt attacking de Gaulle. Roosevelt then asked Stalin how he thought the Germans could be defeated rapidly. Without a moment's thought, the Soviet leader replied that an Allied landing had to be made in northern France. Churchill managed to voice his disagreement. The failure of such a project would have created consequences. Eventually, Roosevelt managed to provide him that a success would shorten the war by years. For the next 6 months or so, Operation Overlord was planned in massive detail in London and Washington, with enormous forces were gathered in southern England, 10,000 aircraft, over 4,000 landing crafts, and 1,500 warships. Eisenhower was made supreme commander, but a number of disrupts over strategy had to be resolved over the operation could go ahead. American commanders rejected de Gaulle's idea of using the French resistance as an alternative to air raids on the German transport system in France and Belgium. This led to outrage among the French, who were to lose as many 3,000 civilians in June, one 48-hour period at the end of May 1944. But by then, the French railways were all but destroyed, as were most of the Seine and Lieuport bridges. Then the Allied forces the problem of where to land. The Pas de Calais was nearest, while Normandy was less heavily defended. Normandy was fairly agreed on, as intelligence indicated that the Germans were convinced of a chase beachhead. To make sure that Germans remained convenient if its cause was bombed heavily, and a faction army group under the command of General Patton was set up in Kent. In fact, the German generals were divided on a subject. Von Richthofen, the commander-in-chief in Western Europe, believed the landings would be the Pas de Calais, in charge of the shore defenses would be Normandy. Because of the disrupt, German forces had to be divided between the two. As with June, D-Day approached, the Germans were given a false sense of sanctuary by a storm raging in the Channel. Ramil was even away with his wife in Germany. In fact, the foul weather delayed the invasion for 24 hours. On the night of 5th June, the wind suddenly dropped. At 9:30 p.m., a secret message was broadcast by the BBC, which gave the go-ahead for the French resistance to cut more railway lines across the country. Nearly 1,000 successful attacks took place. During the days following, the SS took a terrible revenge on villages suspected of involvement. At 11:55 p.m., the first British paratroopers landed 6 miles north of Caen, and the invasion had begun. By the end of the following day, an enormous fleet of landing craft had managed to put 156,000 men ashore on 5 Normandy beaches. With one example, under later German fire, they expected even so. There was serious traffic snare-ups and many soldiers drowned after their landing craft were flooded by the heavy seas. And there was another setback. The British and Canadians failed to take Caen on the first day. It took a month, and the medieval town was flattered in the process, which the Americans missed one of their beaches, and the capture of Churchburg was seriously delayed. Then from 19th to 22nd June, the advance from the beachheads were hampered by one of the worst storms in Europe for 40 years. Built in General Operation Overlord was strategic a success. Once the landings had been calculated, the Allied commanders knew that if it would be next to impossible for the Germans to dislodge their forces from northern France. On the other hand, the German response was confused. What should we do? Von Richard was asked end the war. What else? He replied. Hitler dismissed them for defeatism. Hitler dismissed. Ramil was also suddenly removed from command while recovering from injuries sustained when his staff car was struck by an Allied fighter. He had been involved in Colonel von Stussberg's heroic attempt to assassinate Hitler on 20th of July, but the bomb only succeeded in injuring Hitler. Ramil was offered the choice between suicide and the People's Court. He chose suicide. In Normandy, the Allies twice allowed a large number of German divisions to slip through the net. Through some 50,000 POWs were taken. Roosevelt von Kurz was accused of trying to negotiate the surrender of his own forces. While he was recalled to Berlin, he committed suicide rather than face Hitler's wrath. On his body was a note which read, "The German people have suffered such unspeakable lies that the time has come to put an end to these horrors. Part of northern France was now liberated. The time had come for an Allied landing in the south. Operation Advil took place on 15th August with 15,000 Allied troops landing on the Côte d'Azur. On the same day, Eisenhower's plans to bypass Paris were seconded by resistance uprising in the city. De Gaulle ignored the Supreme Commander's expression and ordered the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc to liberate the city. Unaware that what to do, Leclerc sent a detachment ahead with orders to mix with American troops if they had got to the suburbs first. Eisenhower realized that just as a temporary ceasefire between the Germans, Commander General Judgment von Kurz was the local resistance expired. Paris is not to fall into the hands of the enemy except as a heap of rubble. Signed Hitler to the dismay von Kurz. But the Francophone had no intentions of destroying Paris, and he surrendered with Luftguard's forces arrived on 25th of August. Just then, the news broke out that SS soldiers had broken into Marshal Petrain's hotel room and taken his as a violent prisoner to Belfort. He had been planning to go to Paris himself. He cleared the way for General de Gaulle, who promised himself President of France from the step of the Hotel de Ville in Paris. There were following a distant parade through the streets, despite the disaster from a few remaining German snipers. By the end of 26th of August 1944, after 4 years of brutal opposition, the City of Light was once again free. Well, that concludes day 10, 11 days of remembrance. Well, I thank the veterans for fighting so I could be free and could do these videos, so I could walk wherever I want. Thank you. And if you see a veteran having a bad day, give them a tea or a coffee and they just need something to talk to. And just say thank you. Well, that's it for day 10.